It was a bright sunny day when he arrived in town. None of us believed anything bad would come of a new arrival. Our town is a small town with few visitors, though we should have wondered why there was suddenly someone who wanted to live in this town in the middle of nowhere. But it was a bright and sunny day, so only joy filled us residents when we learned of our new neighbor. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a fit body. My sister could not keep her eyes off of him. One day, as I was walking out of school, I saw him. In our town, we're quite neighborly and all get along. I knew everyone, but no one seemed to know this man, so I decided to be the first. I walked up to him and introduced myself. "Hello," I said. "I noticed you're new here, so I thought I'd introduce myself. I'm Jerry." I held out my hand. He took my hand and said, "Drake Fresby." His voice was not so deep as I had expected it to be. I later learned that he had only recently graduated while I was still in my last year of high school. Because there wasn't much of an age gap between us, we became good friends. Soon, he was known and loved by the whole town as if he'd been living there his entire life. He attended church on Sundays, worked 8 hours a day, went to every barbecue and social event he was invited to. It was a dark, cloudy day when we all attended the funeral service for the Smiths. The 5 of them living in our town had all died when their house burned down while they were inside. The only remains that were found were ashes and the twisted metal frames of Grandpa Smith's glasses. No one knew what had caused the fire, but we did indeed speculate. The most common theory was that a cigarette had been left unattended, but to our knowledge, none of the Smiths had ever smoked. James Smith, who lived somewhere in New York, had come down for the funeral. He was the younger brother to John Smith, who was 29 years old, married to Clara Smith, and the father of 2 little Smith boys. Everyone knew the Smiths, and it was a sad day to see James allow tears to come from his eyes at the funeral of the rest of his family. It wasn't even a month later when another house burned down, killing everyone inside. We all attended yet another funeral. The same 2 things happened another month later. People died in a fire, and we all attended the funeral. The same 2 events occurred the next month and the month after that. After 2 more funerals, there was not another fire in that town. We all thought that the winter months would prevent more deaths. It was a cold, dry Sunday morning, and the bodies of the mayor, his wife, and his only daughter were found on the 3 crosses outside of the church. That was the one day that no one attended church. At first glance, you could not tell how the 3 people had died, for their bodies had so many cuts and slashes on them. Later that night, the sheriff told all the townspeople to remain indoors and not to leave the house alone. He did this over the radio channel that he shared with the mayor. "We have every reason to believe that this is murder," I heard him say over the radio. "We just want everyone to know that we're doing our best to stop." He was cut short as we all heard someone run into the room and yell, "There's been another murder, sir." "Damn it, hasn't even been 24 hours since the last 3. The sheriff yelled back as the other officer ran out of the room. We heard the sheriff get up to leave, but he seemed to remember he was broadcasting and said, "I gotta go, folks. Something's been called to my attention. Have a good night and pray to God for safety before you go to bed." He stopped broadcasting and everyone in my household was quiet as we all said a silent prayer for our friends and family members. Nothing was the same in our little town from that point on. At least 2 people died per week, but the killer could not be found. Everyone was included in the killings. There were no exceptions. Men, women, children alike were killed. Sometimes a house pet was even killed along with its owners. The killer seemed to want no witnesses whatsoever. But one night, the killer made a mistake. After all the children were asleep, the sheriff told everyone to turn on their television, for the footage of the killer had been recovered from a security camera. That night, the adults and the children who snuck out of their beds saw the killer. Every inch of his skin was covered. He was obviously fit, as we could easily tell from how he murdered his victims. What was most disturbing was the mask he wore. He wore a weird mask covering more than half his face and a big hoodie, which were stained with blood. Only his eyes were visible. At one point, he turned his head towards the camera. I gasped, for in the gap where his eyes were, Grandpa Smith's lenses were placed. This was how we all discovered that the fires were no accidents. In the next 2 weeks, there were no murders, but we were not naive enough to believe that the killer had finally stopped. In fact, this short period of no murders increased our fears. I'm sure the sheriff and his men will catch up to him soon, Drake said as he ate his burger. Though it was a small town, we were fortunate enough to have a diner. It's a small town and it's getting smaller. The killer has to live here, so all you have to do is find someone who would be a reasonable suspect. Yeah, like someone who hasn't lived in the town as long as everyone else. I knew these thoughts were wrong, but it made sense in my mind. Drake was newer to the town, even though he'd been living in it for quite a while at that time. I guess you're right, I responded. Of course I am, he said casually as he continued eating. I bought my first gun after the next murder. I was not going to allow myself to be killed by a man who caused so much fear. I carried my revolver with me whenever I was outside. If I saw that mask anywhere near me, I was going to blow the wearer's brains to kingdom come. There was a part of me that wanted to find the killer just so I could be the one to end it all. I wanted to be the town hero. A month passed and I hadn't gotten my chance to kill the killer yet. People were still dying. Our town had been reduced to only 8 households. We wanted to leave, but we were afraid that the killer would follow us and then start killing everyone in the place that we would have moved to. As time went on, I started carrying a flashlight with me, for a fear of the dark had grown inside me. One Sunday night, my mother invited Drake over for dinner. It had been a couple of days since we had talked, for the fact that he was still alive had made me suspect him even more. A sort of bitter distrust for him had grown inside me. This is why I had both my flashlight and my revolver strapped to my belt. As we ate dinner, my parents asked Drake questions about how he was doing, and my sister Julia kept flirting with him. I remained silent for the most part. As we were eating dessert, Drake excused himself to the bathroom. A few minutes later, all the lights in the house had turned off. I struggled to get my flashlight off my belt, and I turned it on to a terrible sight. The man in the hoodie mask was standing behind my sister with a large knife to her throat. My parents' throats were already slit, and there was blood all around them. Something near the bathroom caught my eye, and I gasped in horror as I saw the door open with Drake's body lying halfway through the door. But where was his head? My eyes were back on the killer when I saw what was in the hand not holding the knife at my sister's throat. He held Drake's severed head, which had the look of pure terror on it. A wave of guilt crashed over me as I realized that I had assumed the worst in my friend. Drake had died without my trust. Tears were streaming down Julia's eyes. I removed my gun from my holster, aimed at the man's head, cocked it. Let her go, I yelled shakily. I will shoot. The killer slowly slit my sister's throat as I screamed at him to stop. My flashlight went dark and I knew the meaning of fear. There was movement. Bang! I fired my first shot. I'm not scared of you. You should surrender. I have a revolver, I said as I backed my way towards the door. Movement again. Bang! Something else moved. Before I knew it, another shot had been fired and I had accidentally killed the cat. I bumped into the wall. Bang! Tears were coming from my eyes now. My back found the door. I saw more movement. Bang! I heard a strange, pitiful whining. Damn it, I shot the dog. I was outside. I stepped on the street and I looked all around me. The killer was nowhere to be seen. I saw my bedroom window as I kept walking backwards. Just then I bumped into someone. I turned around and seeing the killer ripped off his mask and hoodie. Instinctively, I backed up slightly and put the revolver to his head, but I did not fire. I just stood there in shock, for where a face should have been, there was nothing. I was too terrified to do anything as I looked into the black void. Then my throat was slit. On the night of a blood moon, I breathed my final breath outside my window.